the beginnings of the idea was this idea of a studio or sort of a motor of sorts, to sort of like construct or make something within the warehouse that would exist in these two spaces. So I think that set me down another sort of like a route of thinking about photography and what actually constitutes a photograph now, what's important as a photograph now. I then sort of started thinking about a short story I read years ago by Borges about a country of cartographers that maps its whole country on a one-to-one map. It's got a famous story, and somehow the map gets disregarded and neglected, and as it's disregarded and neglected, the infrastructure of the country is too, and it kind of somehow evaporates or falls into complete disrepair. So I started thinking about that and thinking about the possibility of using sort of like digital printing, or perhaps on a one-to-one scale, to somehow document something that could then be sort of like represented within the galleries, but produced within the sort of the warehouse. And of course that brought me up against this brick wall of actually what is photography and what is important as photography. What's the point of photography now? I remember going to Venice years ago for the Biennale and thinking there's no point taking pictures of Venice, because you could just go and choose one off the internet, whichever one you fancied. And it wasn't until I was doing a talk, I think down in Cornwall, and I was putting back together some sort of slide images, and I thought I'd show images of this work that was ceased during its construction. It was a temporary public work in London. But I'd taken a lot of documentation of this building, which I was working on to actually make into a public work, a physical public work in itself. I thought, oh, that kind of could be interesting, because this building no longer exists, that was demolished to be redeveloped. So that sort of sense of that photography can witness something seemed very important and interesting to me, and that I had actually witnessed this thing. At the same time, I was also looking at old images from another work around the same time, made in Mardin, in the southeast of Turkey, in a predominantly sort of Kurdish city. It was an incredibly kind of picturesque sort of city, sort of on a hilltop. But what struck me when I went there was the fact that the whole city was being dug up with trenches, with piles of rubble, with kind of water pipes, internet sort of cabling running everywhere. It was like the whole city was being rebuilt. And I just walked every street, documenting every pile of rubble, every trench, every pipe, every sort of like recent building interaction that had happened. And that's that's part of the exhibition now, that you'll see downstairs. It was a very particular time, just after the Arab Spring. We were very close proximity to the border of Syria at the time, sort of, and you could see things going on sort of like across that way. And it struck me that the amount of sort of like work that was going on within this small city was obviously motivated by some politic. And that politic was quite ambiguous, but still it was kind of somehow a political action of sorts. But the photographs I'd never shown, somehow I thought, well, maybe a nice coupling somehow between the Heygate, a building that's been demolished that no longer exists, and then a series of building works in an ancient sort of city in the far southeast of Turkey that are now, the holes are filled in, the pipes are buried, all sense of what had happened there has gone. So in a sense you've got a building coming up being rebuilt, and you've got a building being demolished, taken down, obviously rebuilt as another building, but both underpinned by a certain politic. And I think that's ultimately what I was interested in the first place. I mean, originally the project in London, in South London, was motivated by the idea to make a burial mound, to take a public building to bury itself back in itself, to become something of a sort of a commentary upon a point in time that I was born into and lived through, a post-war sort of Britain, and a Britain with a sort of vision of kind of progress and support, a welfare state, a national health, and the fact that this was somehow crumbling, falling apart. In the end, we ended up with social housing, with a council housing sort of estate, which is something I was avoiding initially, sort of like because it's very emotive. These are people's homes, but ultimately it never happened. And all I had left was these photographs and this model of what we were building. So what we have in the exhibition is a reconstruction a relatively kind of accurate approximation of two of the flats from the building which we were working with. So you have this sort of sense of somebody inhabiting this block of flats that's trying to invoke the sort of like the vision of a place that's gone by rebuilding, but also by sort of reprinting on a one-to-one scale this building that has gone. But not just the building, it's the sort of sense of that world, that political structure that actually allowed those buildings to exist and those people to make those buildings their home. You know, aside from sort of like the argument of whether it was a nice place to live or etc., etc., it was people's homes ultimately. And then with those prints, upstairs we've taken the one-to-one photographs of the Heygate and we've sandwiched them between sort of like plate glass, and then they're routed into sort of like large timbers, which are affixed to sort of like offcuts of steel girder from a building being demolished up the road, and given this sort of tension by these old lorry straps that hold them together. The cross of St. George, something I found in a junk shop. I could have kept looking at them thinking, these have some potential, because they're awkward, they're difficult, and I quite like the awkwardness and the difficultness of them. And I was thinking, like, why am I drawn to these, really? I mean, obviously the ubiquitous cross of St. George, sort of like hanging from windows during football matches, or sort of like in areas where kind of perhaps the politics aren't that of yours, kind of is something which I'm very familiar with. But I'm also very familiar with the cross of St. George on the chest of a sort of a knight, the 12th century, sort of in the Crusades, kind of. And I suppose in a way, then it struck me that this was quite a nice linkage. Nice is probably not the right word, or kind of an interesting linkage between the estate and the point of England at this point in time, specifically, especially whilst going in Scotland, sort of like in relation to a hilltop city in the far southeast of Turkey on the borders of Syria, sort of like just after the Arab Spring. So in a way there was a linkage there which I thought was interesting and slightly kind of awkward and aggravating, sort of, but aggravating in an interesting and a pointful way, and one that when you look underneath and look at the history of St. George and the provenance, actually makes more sense in some ways. You need a few things to make a decent piece of art. You know, you need a decent idea and a different thought. You need empathy and sort of a good heart, I think, and soul. And then you need sort of like matter. And matter is like language, in that you just take these things that have meaning and they have history, sort of like, and you assemble them, or you sort of like you give them. I suppose it's like a kind of potion in the end. It's like a spell. You put the stuff in to make this thing become something else somehow. And I suppose that's what language and literature does. Sort of like an art can do it as well. It kind of still amazes me, that sort of sense of all the matter and material, sort of like the different sort of like bits and pieces that has to come together. If you imagine them all laid out, and the fact they all have to go into some order to become this thing, and all the specific bits of wood, the sort of screws, the slotted screws, the penhead screws, the brass screws, the rusty screws, the nails, the sort of bolts, kind of that go into a building, sort of that sort of sense of making a room solid when you run sort of plaster around the edges, so that it's sort of like it's absolutely sealed in, that there isn't a gap between the skirting and the wall. It's like, it's that kind of sculpturalness of it that interests me, because I think when those constructions do work, and they often work better when you're in there by yourself, or in a limited number of people, it's like a glitch in reality, because this space has been built just for you, for this moment, sort of like, and that's the oddness of it, sort of like that this space never had to exist, never should have existed. It's just been built at this point of time for you to come and inhabit it, sort of, and for that inhabitation to sort of happen.